Yeah, so my name's Caleb. Thanks for the intro there, Daniel. I've lived here in Pasadena for about 15 years, and it's really great to see so many familiar faces and some new faces also. Feels like folks from different circles of my life are congregating here, and so I'm really excited to give this talk about the Christian mystics, which I call Coming Home to the Mystics. This will actually be my third time giving this talk, but hopefully for most of the audience it's their first time hearing it. As Daniel kind of alluded to, there's going to be a little bit of my own narrative in this talk that has to do with like how I came to the Catholic Church. Not a lot of detail, but kind of I feel like it's important for me to share that as like a real story that's grounded in my life and how some of these characters and some of these ideas have affected me on that journey. So I became a Catholic in 2023. I was baptized, coming up on, it's going to be 3 years in a week. And I was raised in a small non-denominational network of home churches that really instilled in me from a very early age like a love for the Bible, a love for Scripture, and I think just like a desire to have like a genuine faith and genuine kind of relationship with God. And so that's kind of like the framing of like my personal life, and some of that will be woven into this talk. And we'll have time for Q&A at the end. I think I'm going to go maybe 40 minutes at most. At least that's my intention. So in terms of a roadmap here, I have a few slides, and there's going to be basically 3 sections. The first one is like, what is mysticism? We're going to kind of dive into like, what do we mean by that term? What do we not mean by it? And then we're going to talk about who are the mystics? Who are the Christian mystics? And also like, what do they have to tell us? What are their thoughts and ideas and teachings? And then I want to end with just a few thoughts on the idea of coming home and kind of get to the point where I connect the dots back here to the title, Coming Home to the Mystics. So let's get started. What is mysticism? I'm going to recruit the audience's help in a couple of slides here to kind of narrow down what we mean by this, but I wanted to start with a little silly exercise I thought of using fonts. So Google Slides has lots of Google fonts available and lots of Google emojis that will help us here. So mysticism is a big word, right? And it has lots of connotations. And so let's talk about the ones that we're not talking about tonight. The first one is not, it's this magical idea, right? So I think there can be a sense in which mysticism means, Harry Potter, astrology type of thoughts, and those are not necessarily, bad uses of the word, but that's not what we're going to be talking about here tonight. We're not going to be talking about the Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown, dusty manuscripts, and the secret history of the church, right? That might be a nice way you could use this word, but that's not what we're talking about. We're going to talk about something else, and we're going to use this nice font called Spectral for the rest of the slides. So now's the point at which I want to ask, like, does anyone have words or ideas or thoughts about what mysticism is? And anything goes. We're gonna get there together. So I'm curious if people have thoughts in their brains about this.
Connecting like a spiritual world to like the everyday world.
Okay. Yes, connecting the divine to the mundane, or yep. If you've seen this talk before, you have to throw some words out. Help me along. Yes. Beauty.
Like ecstasy, and kind of like a lot of saints that gets to more of the profound, like what God's love is for us.
Yeah. Yep. Jen.
I also think of the saints like on the cross when I think of mysticism.
Okay. And any kind of ideas about what they taught or how they lived?
Just like how their suffering kind of helped them bring them closer to God.
Okay, closer to God. I like that. Anyone else?
Prophecy.
Sorry?
Like the prophets.
Okay. Yeah, in what sense do you see that?
Divine communication.
Communication? Yeah. Yes, kind of maybe a closeness with God? Yeah. Okay, so these are all great ideas. I think we're circling around. The kind of concepts that I would maybe put forward for us to kind of like anchor on as we go through this. There's one that I really like, which is experience over explanation. So that's kind of a little device I sometimes have in my head when I'm thinking about the mystical way of life or, way of living, is that if you study a lot of the so-called mystics, and we'll get into who they are, they have a prioritization of their own experience of God inside, over and above maybe just pure theological explanations of things. And they personally are anchored to, a deep sense of connectedness with God, like the prophets, or like those saints, who have gone through some kind of suffering, and their experience of God is very real to them. So experience over explanation is one. Another concept we're going to run into quite a bit is the idea of union, right? Which is it's very similar to that, that intimate connection that these people have with God and lived and talked about. They're circling around some kind of union of themselves with God in some mysterious sense. So these emojis are meant to kind of convey that, right? There's a sense of silence, right? Of letting the explanations fall away, and of a deep intuitive knowing about God. It has to do with prayer. It has to do with beauty and seeing beauty. All right, so that's just to orient us a little bit. The second part of this section on trying to define our terms here, we're going to just look at 3 quotes that are going to help us get even more precise with it. This first one is from an Anglican writer and spiritual director who worked around the turn of the 19th to 20th century. Her name's Evelyn Underhill, and she has a wonderful book called Mysticism that goes into this whole topic. And I'll just read the quote from her book. Mysticism is the art of union with reality. So there's that union. The mystic is a person who has attained that union in greater or less degree, or who aims at and believes in such attainment. So I don't think any one of these quotes are going to perfectly capture what we're talking about, but they're going to help us, right? They're going to be instructive, getting to the point. So some thoughts I have about this quote. I think union is core here, and a sense of discovering the connection between ourselves and God, which here Evelyn Underhill uses the word reality with a capital R. I think we'll see that maybe attained is not the best word to use, because in the experiences of many of these mystics, they never talk about having attained anything. It's almost like they fell into it, or it attained them in a way. But this is a great quote to help us get centered here. Here's another one from, I think this is one of maybe 2 places in the Catechism where the word mystical is used. So this says, spiritual progress tends toward ever more intimate union with Christ. This union is called mystical because it participates in the mystery of Christ through the sacraments. So there is a sense, I think, of mystery. I mean, anytime you're dealing with something that you can't explain, that's kind of a mystery, right? And I like this quote because it also contains the word union, and because it recognizes that the Church's teaching is in many ways a container for the mysteries of the sacraments. And that at its core, I think what we're all involved in as practicing Catholics is something mysterious and something that is difficult to explain, and that we participate in by design on a regular basis. Okay, last quote. This one's a little bit silly, but it's actually my favorite of the 3 in terms of learning what we're talking about. This is from a French philosopher who worked around the same time as Evelyn Underhill, 19th to 20th century. And he says, we represent religion then as the crystallization brought about by a scientific process of cooling of what mysticism has poured while hot into the soul of man. So I like this one for 2 reasons. One is that this tells us about kind of the linguistics of the word mystical, right? So if we look back at some of the folks from the early centuries in the early church who are considered mystics today, they weren't walking around calling themselves that. This term really started to be used when people, mainly Western thinkers and philosophers around the 19th to the 20th century started thinking about different religions comparatively, and realizing that there were similarities between not only between folks in a given religion like Catholicism, but that there could be a thing called mysticism that popped up in other religions as well. And it had to do with this kind of inner knowing, this experience over explanation. And so Henry Bergson is writing in that kind of stream of thought. And so it's kind of funny, he calls it a scientific process of cooling. You can imagine all these people. I imagine, the steam engine age, people are trying to make science out of everything. But that tells you a little bit about, mystical, and that it's a category that people use to understand the way that folks live. The second reason I like this quote is because it introduces like a kind of, I guess, a dichotomy between religion versus mysticism, right? And there's this idea that religion, maybe the structure and the set of practices and the culture of a religion, is really just a container for something that he calls mysticism. And that something has been poured into the soul of man in a way that has flowered into the structure of religion in a way. And so that's just another thing to keep in mind. It kind of goes along with experience over explanation. Okay, let's move on. This is my last slide of this section. And in the spirit of experience over explanation, instead of maybe trying to remember all these quotes and emojis and stuff, I'd like to invite you to maybe anchor to an experience in your past that you might consider mystical. And here's mine. This was the first backpacking trip that I ever went on in 2012. And I was with my friend Mike here. He's the one who dragged me along. But I had an amazing time on this trip. And I've always struggled to describe how it changed me, but it did. And I've literally reorganized my life so that I can keep going back to the Sierra Nevada as often as I can. As my friend Matt knows, now I'm dragging him along to other trips. But what was it about this? You know, this is just a regular old picture. We were at a place called Glen Allen. But this captures to me the feeling that I had on that trip. And it was more than just, going on a great vacation and taking a break and having a margarita in a pool or something, right? And it was like, I felt kind of like the weight of my whole life lift off my shoulders. And I was in this open, spacious place, and I was just happy to be there. And I wasn't worried about going back home or anything. And I just intuitively felt this is connected to God. You know, this is how I want to live. This is what.
You were hungry because I didn't prepare enough food.
I was also starving. Yeah. But yeah. So this kind of experience, maybe you have something like this in your past. It doesn't have to be a great feeling thing. Maybe just it could have been part of a great trial or suffering you went through, or just a big life event, something that just kind of felt discontinuous with your everyday life, and that you saw God in that. That's what we mean by mystical. Let's talk about who are the mystics now. This is a book called The Way of the Mystics, and it's a nice book because this author, John Michael Talbot, who's also a musician, kind of goes through more systematically some of the big names over the years, over the centuries, and gets into their specific lives and their angles on things. I throw this up here, and including this quote from his introduction. These celebrated spiritual pioneers from some of the major Christian traditions devoted themselves to delving deeper into the reality of God. Okay, that seems to align with what we were talking about before. But I just want to say the rest of these slides, and we're almost halfway through, this is not the type of presentation I'm about to give. I'm not going to step through a bunch of people and try to give us a big overview. I'm going to look at a couple of ideas and 3 mystics specifically who have helped me, but I'll refer you, if you're interested in this, in more of a just kind of understanding the landscape and the names, this is a great book. We're going to get acquainted with the mystics by thinking about what they have to tell us. And as much as we've been saying explanations are not mystical, the mystics, when they write, they love to explain things. They love to think in stages and phases and steps and rooms and mansions and any kind of metaphor that helps them be authentic about their inner experience. And so we're going to take basically a simplified version of some of these phases or steps, and we're just going to look at each one, 1, 2, 3. So we have purification, illumination, and union as a way that many of the mystics in the Christian tradition talk about different seasons of life, different ways of understanding where they're at in their walk with God, in their learning, in their journey. And I've started off with some arrows here, but those arrows aren't super important because you might think, oh, I'm going to start with purification and then I'll be purged and get to illumination, and then I'll have union and I'll just be blissed out for the rest of my life. But sometimes you're going the other way. And sometimes you just go, who knows, from one to the next, and you can see these things, and if you zoom out and look at your life, you might see it one way, and then on a given week, you might go through all 3 of these and wonder where you are and where's God and what's happening. So let's just not get too attached to feeling like we're climbing a ladder or something, right? Just think about these as independent seasons of life that we're going to look into. So to accomplish this, I want to just share a little bit more about my own personal journey as we look at some mystics who have really helped me through these stages of life. Let's start with this let's call it a season of purification. And we're going to use St. John of the Cross. Who's heard of St. John of the Cross? Yeah, good. He's a pretty well-known guy. So he was a Spanish Carmelite friar. He worked closely with St. Teresa of Avila. We've probably heard of her too. And has anyone ever heard the term the dark night of the soul? Yes. Okay, that's John of the Cross. That's his signature phrase. And he has a work called The Dark Night of the Soul that kind of maps the soul's journey through purification into a deeper union with God. And he's considered one of the church's greatest mystical theologians. So I think about purification as, like personally, I think about it as wrestling with self. And it's kind of this thought of like, as soon as you decide, hey, I'm gonna have a real faith, and I'm gonna see where that goes, and I'm gonna try to live my life with God. One of the first things that you realize is that's difficult, and that you run into yourself, right? You run into the challenge of your own ego and your limitations and your attachments and maybe your addictions, your false identities, and it may feel like you just started your journey and God is nowhere to be found. It might feel like a darkness or a dryness, some of these mystical writers call it, like God has been removed or is like hidden from you somehow. And this is what John of the Cross writes all about. And looking back at my life, I see several dark nights of the soul, but the one that I'm thinking of is like when I first set off to college, like late high school, college. It was like I kind of been raised with a certain worldview and a certain faith view, and go off to UC San Diego, and like I'm surrounded by chaos, right? All kinds of people with different ideas and thoughts and worldviews, and some with faith and some with no faith, and professors telling me this and that, and job offers and relationships, and I went through a period of like, oh, where's God? This feels horrible. This feels confusing. This feels dark. And I know this can be a common experience for folks, like leaving home for the first time. And the mystics call this a necessary part of life. And an example I have written down here is Jesus' temptation in the wilderness. I always found it really profound that as soon as Jesus, had the Spirit of God come down on him when he was baptized, it says instantly he was whisked away into the desert, right, for 40 days and 40 nights, and he was tempted by the devil. And Jesus wasn't necessarily being purified of sin, but he was running into this same season of life, right? I think that's what that story is there to show us, that Jesus had to ask these questions too, right? And learn to let go and learn to rely completely on God to meet his needs. So this is purification. And I have some other references down here. I always think of Augustine's Confessions, seeing a person really just struggling with their own sin and their own fallen nature. So yeah, let's move on. Our second season here is called Illumination. And anyone ever heard of a guy named St. Francis? Okay. Yes, I recently learned that St. Francis of Assisi has the most books written about him than any other human being in the Library of Congress. So he's a pretty popular fellow. We don't need to rehash his whole biography, but we know that he had a major conversion, right? And that he was raised in a wealthy setting and had an experience maybe of purification, but then fell into this wonderful way of life that turned into the Franciscan tradition that was based on him seeing God everywhere. And we have stories of St. Francis calling the animals his brothers and sisters and talking to the moon and stars, and it's like his eyes were opened, right? And he loved to be with the lepers and to serve and not have any worldly possessions. And so I think of illumination as seeing God everywhere. And for me, this was there was a time in my life, it was kind of after I had graduated college, I moved back to actually into the Pasadena area. And I was like, I had a job that was kind of sending me around the world on travel. And I was meeting lots of people, and I was in close quarters with other people who were at different stages of life. And it just felt like a time when a lot of things were happening. But I was having my eyes open. Like, by God's grace, I was learning about the diversity in the world, about the challenges in the world, about the everyday, the mundane, right? The struggle. And I think this time in my life, which is really like my mid-20s, I'm 36 now, so mid-20s to maybe like early 30s, was really a big part of me deciding eventually that I wanted to come to the Catholic Church, because I found that I wanted to live my faith in a way that was more connected to the reality of the human experience and to the diversity that I saw in the world. And so I have this picture here, which is a modern work of art that depicts this moment from the life of St. Francis, and there's so many. But this one, to me, just it speaks to me. And I remember the first time I read about this, I was just really blown away, and I was like, that's incredible. You know, that's Christ in a person. And what this represents, does anyone know about this story? Yeah? Jesus? Yeah.
Essentially, St. Francis was sent to the Holy Land, where
Yep.
I think they were mid-crusade or something. And he actually met with the then Sultan to try to negotiate some peace.
Right. Yeah, so Jesus said there's a story of St. Francis going to the Holy Land during one of the Crusades, and I think the story goes that he walked across the battle lines unarmed, and he wasn't necessarily trying to make a bid for peace or convert the Sultan to Christianity, but he just considered the Sultan his brother and just walked over there to express fraternity with the other side, and that was St. Francis's way of living. There's other examples in Scripture. I think of Peter. There's a story in the book of Acts of Peter seeing a dream about a bunch of animals and realizing, oh, they're clean. I shouldn't call any person unholy or unclean. And so, yeah, this is a real phase that the mystics talk about. Often, after you go through a purification and you kind of become like abandoned to God, so to speak, that you start to see God everywhere, and you start to see God in your neighbor and in other humans and in animals. All right, let's talk about this last season. And again, as you read mystical writers, you'll see them talk about these things, sometimes different names. I think who was it? Saint Ignatius talks about desolation and consolation. Right, those kind of overlap with some of these. But this last one we're talking about is called union, and the mystic I've chosen to represent this is Meister Eckhart. Meister Eckhart was a German Dominican friar, preacher, and his sermons were very daring, I'd say, for the time. And he explored this idea that he called the ground of the soul, which is a place in the soul of humans where God and the human person meet in a profound way. So this quote, "The soul must melt and flow into God, and God must pour back into the soul. Such is the union where no distinction remains." What is union? In my mind, this is resting in God. So it's maybe coming to a place in your life where it's not nirvana, it's not bliss necessarily. It's not like every day like that picture where I was standing on that mountain and feeling totally free, but it may feel like that sometimes. But I think of the phrase a peace that kind of passes understanding or exceeds your explanation. And there's this kind of sense that you may have a deep just knowing that your life is God's life, belongs to God. You might have a sense that God is acting through you as you're surrendering your own will and your own life story and narrative, and realizing that this union is a real thing. And it's a thing that lots of people over the centuries have talked about. And as we'll see, I think it's very core to Jesus' teaching. In my own experience, I would like to say that since I became a Catholic, it's all union, it's all perfect bliss and all that. It's not. But I do feel that God has given me a structure in my life to learn to live this out on a daily basis, and to choose union with God, through the ministries and things and circles of people that have been put in my path. I think I'm learning to share and to give and to engage with people in a way that every day more and more I have to kind of like let myself go and just say, my life is not my own. I've been through the dark nights enough times, And I love Eckhart because his teachings are so simple in a sense. He's really not concerned too much with a lot of external details and frameworks. He's really precisely interested in what's happening inside the heart and what does it feel like to allow your soul to melt and flow into God. I do really like going back to the Sierra as often as I can because I do touch back on that same sense of peace every time I'm up there backpacking for a few days. Here's the last slide of this section, and there's only one slide in the coming home section, so I think we're on track. About 10 more minutes. I call this one practical mysticism, and I want to share a little bit about contemplative prayer. Growing up in my tradition, we didn't really have recited prayer or the concept of contemplative prayer. It was very spontaneous prayer, very authentic prayer, but I wasn't aware of other types of prayer. And so as I explored the mystics, I discovered this idea of contemplative prayer, and there's this particular anonymous mystic in English. They think he's an English monk or priest. He wrote a kind of a practical manual, for practicing a contemplative life, and it's called The Cloud of Unknowing. And there's a couple quotes here. By love, God may be gotten and held, but by thought, never. And a naked intent directed to God is enough. So has anyone heard of Thomas Merton? How about Thomas Keating? No? Has anyone heard of centering prayer? Some of you have, because I told you about it. So in the mid-20th century, really after like the 60s, this sex, drugs, and rock and roll, there were a lot of young Americans and Westerners going to the East because they were finding, a real genuine spirituality for them in Eastern practices and Buddhism. And these folks I have listed here, really Thomas Merton and Thomas Keating, I'd say were the most influential in this area. But they said, hey, did you know we're sitting on this rich tradition of contemplative, mindful practice of prayer within Christianity? And they worked to kind of mine that out of the depths and articulate it and share it. And this kind of prayer has really helped me. So has anyone ever practiced just like a mindfulness meditation? It's a pretty common thing to see these days. There's a Christian mystical version of that, where it's really about starting with an intent to God, that you want to be submitted to God or just open to receiving. And then you just sit for 20 minutes, and every time you realize that you're caught up in a thought, caught in a thought loop about yesterday or tomorrow or your anxiety or what your mom said or whatever, you just gently kind of realize that you've been caught in that thought and you let it go. And in centering prayer, you use the idea of a prayer word to kind of denote your movement back to center. And that's taken directly from this Cloud of Unknowing, which was, I think, 13th century or 14th century. But this is I think, a really practical kind of tool, contemplative prayer, to move from the realm of explanation into experience, and to just realize how much our thinking minds can maybe cloud our deeper knowing about the reality of our union with God that's actually present all the time. And so this kind of thing has really helped me, and I recommend it. Okay, let's wrap this up. So why coming home? Three things actually. One is the mystics have been a kind of a homecoming for me. Coming into the Catholic Church, it was really discovering these thinkers and writers and people who walk with God. That was the main thread that I followed into the Catholic Church. And I'm happy to share more about that story with you in person another time. But I was, in the language of this talk, I think I was raised in a setting that actually had a very mystical core to it. There was a great emphasis on union with God and on paying attention to what was happening inside and being true to that. And so when I found the mystics, it was like, oh, like they're speaking my language, but they're from this other tradition that is so broad and connected and diverse, and so I kind of just follow that thread in, right? And I feel very at home now, in large part because of these people over the centuries. So in a way, I've personally come home. The second point here is that in the last 3 years, I've met a lot of so-called cradle Catholics and folks who have been raised in the faith. And I have perceived that there is a desire and a yearning to be able to talk about your inner experience of your faith and the reality of your life with God, and that there's maybe not always language to do that. And so for those of you maybe in that boat here this evening, like I want to share with you that you've got it here, right? These mystical writers and thinkers, many of whom we're familiar with and we know as great saints and doctors of the church, that's a wonderful, rich repository of a reality of walking with God that goes beyond maybe the explanations or the rituals that may have become a little bit dusty over time. It's I think much more deeply embedded. Mysticism is much more deeply embedded in the DNA of the church than I think we often realize. And so that's something I'm excited to share with you too. My last point here is to end with a quote here from my favorite mystic, Jesus Christ. I think, this is from John. Jesus answered them, "Those who love me will keep my word, and my Father will love them, and we will come to them and make our home with them." And I love this thought because it kind of turns maybe our human model upside down, right? We might think of, I need to be purified, and then I can be illumined, and then I'll know union, and it's kind of this upward climb. I like this because it kind of turns the language upside down, and Jesus says, well, the Father and I actually want to come make our home with you. Come into your heart. And it takes the burden of figuring everything out kind of away. And I think it's a beautiful reminder that we are created in God's image. And somewhere there is this, as Meister Eckhart says, this ground of the soul, where part of our nature is already meeting with God. And I think if we learn to be quiet and to listen for that, and to approach our faith with a spirit of letting go, then we realize that God is wanting to make a home in us. And I just think that's a really neat idea. So that's all.